Welcome everybody to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm really, really happy to be here with the wonderful Chloe Valdary. We've talked many times. We talk regularly when we can, when our schedules permit. She's been on Voices with Vervaeke, and I've been recorded for her theory of imagination and theory of enchantment. And so it's just been wonderful to get to know Chloe, and I wanted to have Chloe on again to talk about things that are on her mind, and for us to get into a genuine dialogue. Uh, Chloe is part of the board for the Vervaeke Foundation, and we're very happy about that. And so, and Chloe, is there anything more I should say by way of introduction for you, or?
I think that's good. We're definitely working together to solve for the great problem that is the meaning crisis, both in our own corners, but also doing a lot of crossover work and
Yeah,
collaboration, a lot of
yeah,
would you call it opponent processing or
yeah,
the
yeah.
my other fave of yours is like I think you called it courtyard.
Yeah, courtyard rather than courtroom. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
courtyard rather than courtroom way
yeah.
of being, which I just find so delightful. So yes, I'm happy to be back. I love my conversations with you. They are so generative, and I'm happy to be recording another one of these with you.
Excellent. So I thought I'd just turn things over to you about topics you'd like to discuss, and we can just engage in some serious play with
Sure.
those topics.
So one of the things that's really alive for me is the work of David Graeber, specifically his book Debt, The Last 5,000 Years. I was introduced to this book. I came across this book actually after watching a conversation between you and Jordan Hall about the importance of mourning our past gods, right? Mourning the gods that we used to believe in and realizing that they no longer are sufficient or appropriate for the world in which we live. And in the context of that conversation, the book Debt came up because Jordan Hall is talking about economic systems and things like that. So I read Debt, got a big download on patriarchy and the origins of patriarchy and how they came out of a situation in Bronze Age Mesopotamia, Sumer, and modern day Iraq, where you had men, specifically poor men, who were being forced into debt slavery
Mm,
and by the aristocracy, and who started to have to sell their wives and their daughters into slavery, into sex slavery, selling them into sex work, etc., to appease the aristocracy, and how
yes.
among that class of men there began to be this, oh, your honor is based upon whether or not you can protect your wives and daughters from being sold into sex slavery. And
Ah,
so that is actually the origin of patriarchy. And that in and of itself just blew up so many things for me. The relationship between men and women, the way in which men relate to wealth accumulation in terms of their sense of self-worth, the wounds that many men carry when not being able to accumulate wealth in
mm,
this very, you know, uh conspicuous consumptive way. Why we see conspicuous consumption as such a theme in our culture, especially, I think of hip hop, for example.
yeah,
It's such a prominent theme. So that is one thing that's alive for me. And the other thing that's alive for me is your AI video, the video that you recently released. I was just at a talk at a prominent institution where there were thinkers who came together to try to think through the problems that AI can produce and how we might preempt them. I emailed you while I was at this talk, like, what are you doing about AI? Tell me what you're thinking. And you told me that you had a video coming out soon. I watched that video. I was blown away. It was both uh serious and hopeful,
mm,
and really beautiful. So we can talk about both of those things. And I think that there is an intersection
yes,
actually between
yes.
these two things, because one of the questions that was asked at this forum that I attended was, write a headline where you are imagining a future, or that imagines a future where AI produces something positive. And I said, after having read Debt, I said AI basically takes over so much production that countries now have enough money to subsidize a universal basic income.
Mm-hmm.
So I was already thinking about this history of patriarchy and wealth and all these entanglements that David Graeber talked about, and how AI could actually potentially solve for some of those problems. So those are two things that are very much alive for me, and I kick the school ball over to you.
Well, I want to talk about the first one first, because I have not read the book. I
Okay.
vaguely remember Jordan and I talking about that, and we've had a recent video series on governance where we've been
Mm,
wrestling with these issues. Um, but I want to pause on the first thing you said because that's very interesting. So I may have picked up on something, but I may have misread it. It sounds
okay.
like originally patriarchy is an attempt to solve a horrible condition. And in that sense, it's initially a positive response, an adaptive response. So patriarchy is you're a good man if you can uh, support your wives and kids so that they do not have to be sold into sex slavery. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah,
That,
so patriarchy starts out as a protective, adaptive response to social conditions that are terrible. It simultaneously, though,
yeah,
creates or perpetuates the notion that women can be commodified or that women are
sure,
commodities.
sure. Okay,
So it
so
carries that in
yeah,
it.
yeah, excellent. Okay, I often try to find out how something is compelling by finding out how it was originally adaptive.
Yeah.
Right? So it's originally adaptive because it's protective, but it also insinuates the shared presupposition that women
Mm-hmm.
are ultimately commodities. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's powerful, and this is because you get the rise of um, uh, well, literally of civilization. You get the rise of cities, and you get the rise of the military elite. And
Mm-hmm.
because of the military elite, they can just command what they want and demand what they
Mm-hmm.
want. Um,
By force, that's right, by power.
so if that's the case, um, if the shared presupposition, so there's two shared presuppositions then, if I get it correct. One is women can be commodified, and the other one is the pervasive presence of power as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Because right, because that's powering both the aristocrat. It's this is a Hegelian argument that the aristocrat is
Mm-hmm.
also bound and totally
Mm-hmm.
dependent on the system for
Yes.
his, and it's right to say his in this circumstance, his um, sense of self and self worth. Um, so is there also sort of an arms race in that the aristocrat has to um, show his capacity to exercise power or at least threat
Mm-hmm.
over the peasantry or whatever we'll call the opposite, and then the peasantry is trying to constantly come up with ways of being self-sufficient. So, and then the women are basically getting sort of jockeyed back and forth about whether they're going to be exploitative commodities or protected commodities. But it's all still
Yes.
vectored around men's self-worth and self-understanding. Is that a good way of putting it?
I think that is a good way of putting it. I know less about whether or not that creates an arms race among the aristocracy to
Yeah, yeah.
further suppress the peasants, sort of, so to speak. But it does lead to further suppression of the wives of the elite, who now have to be, from the perspective of the aristocratic male, sequestered in the home. Prior to this time, you had a situation where men and women were very much at parity in the sense
Mhm.
of women being out and about, women and being represented in many different roles and many different governing roles across Sumerian civilization. But when this debt crisis takes root, you see men in the aristocracy start to sequester their wives from public life, and the wives of the
Mhm.
elite find it harder to get divorces, for example. And I think that's a way in which the accumulation of not just wealth, but power manifests within the same class. You also, I mean, I think an example of this that I've seen portrayed in one of my favorite films, Dangerous Beauty, which is about Veronica Franco, true story, the courtesan, 16th century Venice. At that time, a courtesan, which was essentially an elite glorified prostitute, only the courtesans had access. They were the only women who had access to the libraries. The
Mm.
wives of the elite could not get access to an education. They were not allowed to be educated. So that's an example of a way in which, even across the same class, women were sequestered and
Yep.
sort of hidden. And something else is interesting. This is also when you start to see, going back to Mesopotamia, you start to see uh, women in the elite classes being veiled to make a distinction between the classes, the different classes, because many of the poor women were being sold into sex slavery. You had a rule across this society that actually poor women and the prostitutes could not wear veils.
Oh, I see. I see.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. So, like, obviously, the book is not just or maybe it is, but it sounds like it's not just a history book. It's trying to understand the origin of something, to try and understand sort of its structural, functional organization, its fundamental grammar.
Yeah.
What does that say about us today? Like, how does it help explicate and elucidate what's going on today in a way that could be helpful? Because I presume you're making
Yeah.
those kinds of connections.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why and I'm very early on in my conclusions about universal basic income. So one of the reasons why I've started thinking seriously about the idea of universal basic income is because I am seeing the ways in which this system of patriarchy has adapted over time, such that we in our society today, if you're on the right, you assume that it has been this innate thing that has existed for all time. And if
Right.
you're on the left, you assume that it's just this thing that was instituted by cruel men,
Right.
right? Who didn't care at all about the women in their lives. And neither of those are actually true.
Right. Right. I
Um,
see that. Yes.
Right. So that's one thing. That's one implication. The other implication is that, or is a question, which is how how has then debt, because when these men who were, farmers, peasants, shepherds, etc., would get into debt, first it was their land that would go, and then it was their wives, and then there was their daughters, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So how does our sense of self how has our sense of self been constructed by this thing called debt?
Mm,
Right? How
mm.
has our sense of self-worth been uh, mangled and upended by debt? And this has happened whether you're in the so-called 1% or whether you're in the 99%. It has transformed and deformed, in a way, our capacity to relate to each other. And here's a fun fact that also comes from the book. The word freedom, etymologically, is connected to the root word of friend.
Mm.
So the word friend and freedom come from the same Germanic root.
Oh, wow. I didn't know.
And yeah, and so originally what it meant to be free was to be bounded in a society where you had rights and responsibilities to your family, to your friends, to your community. That's what it meant to be free.
Yes, yes.
Over time, right? So over time, because of this crazy thing called debt and the way that it works, what it meant to be free became the opposite.
Hmm.
What it means to be free was someone without obligation,
Yeah,
without
yeah,
any
maximal
sense of
choice.
right,
Yes.
without any sense of duty or responsibility or rights, right? Or all rights and no responsibilities, rather. And what's interesting about this is that in the ancient world, what it meant to be a slave was someone who was kidnapped, stripped of all context, right? All sense of belonging, and so therefore had no sense of right and responsibility in the way that was meant to define a free person,
Mm.
right? This is what made a slave a slave. And now we have this curious thing where parts of what defined a slave, right, stripped of all context, no obligation, in terms of obligation to your friend and family because you were kidnapped and removed from the
Yes.
sense of belonging with your friend and family, that has come to mean freedom in our contemporary world? This is wild, gentlemen. This is wild.
Well, I didn't know that etymology. I have been critical of the current conception of freedom as sort of maximal choice and lack of constraint whatsoever. I've been deeply influenced. My friend Dan Chiappi and I were reading Brandam's Reason in Philosophy. We're being reintroduced to the Hegelian notion of freedom, where freedom is, as you said, freedom is your capacity to take on responsibilities because you rationally apprehend the normative good of those responsibilities. So it's the opposite. It's so the free person is the one who ratio religio, who proportionally binds themselves in a good way for the optimal kind of good life. Very different than the person who goes into the supermarket, and is confronted by 100 different flavors of ice cream. But is probably, well, the demographics show, has fewer and fewer genuine friends, and the relationships they do have are much more superficial, much more fragile, much less long lasting. And so that connectedness has been lost, which of course is ultimately, if you buy the argument that agency is what we're trying to enhance in freedom, and that agency means being bound to an environment that you are co-create the environment and you are co-creating the agent arena. This notion of freedom is one that actually undermines agency in a paradoxical fashion. And some people have even noticed that in sort of one way. They've talked about the paradox of choice, that we actually seem to be experiencing ourselves as less free as we more and more maximize choice, because we are overriding the capacity to rationally bind ourselves to normative standards that we mutually make each other accountable for. Instead, let's have highly individualized choice, and that's the model of freedom. And it's a ridiculous model of freedom because it undermines agency. I don't know why you would want that freedom. But I hadn't done the genealogy of it. I didn't realize it was bound into this. I mean, I could see this right there. There's this commodification. There's the arbitrariness of power. And this starts to create an ethos, right? Where freedom is just pure choice, arbitrary choice backed by arbitrary power. That's
also,
go ahead.
Also, the propertization of what was previously a social relationship.
Oh, well, yeah, this is Jordan's whole argument about we've lost the commons, and therefore we've lost access to common law. And the common law model is sort of a really good model of rationality in the Hegelian framework, which can be integrated, I think, with the Platonic. But part of the Hegelian framework is to be rational is to make yourself accountable to the precedents that have been set by common law, but also to try and make precedent that will be accepted as common law by those in the future. And so this bidirectional, retrospective and prospective seeking of recognition and the taking on of responsibilities is actually what makes you somebody who participates in the commons, which of course is where the collective intelligence of distributed cognition is allowed to properly show up and regulate things and give an authority over individual rationality.
Is there a possible situation in which distributed cognition goes off the rails?
Oh, totally. There are many. I mean, and part of what needs to be done right now is to get clearer about these kinds of mistakes. I addressed this a little bit when I gave the talk at Prague on democracy as the way in which we try to optimize distributed cognition, because we try to encode a prioritization of opponent processing, etc. Yeah, I think group dynamics, well, there's one. When opponent processing is replaced with adversarial processing, collective intelligence can just degenerate. That often overlaps with the falling into polarization or falling into populism. There's also groupthink. There's diffusion of responsibility. So there's lots of ways in which collective intelligence can be very, very foolish. And then there's, the one that Jordan and I have been recently talking about. There's the project of creating complicated totalization, in which you try. This is the bureaucratization problem, in which the group will maintain its authority over the individuals through a bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy falls into general systems failure without being able to recognize that it has. So there are lots of errors, and those I think are sort of the prominent ones that need to be reliably addressed if we're going to start invoking more explicitly collective intelligence, especially we try to educate it into collective wisdom.
Is there trying to see what I want to ask.
Okay.
At this juncture. I'm very interested in the intersection of this conversation about patriarchy, where the push, well, I guess it's not a push, it is what it is, where the presence of AI and is coming from. Like, what is the deep yearning behind the emergence of AI on the part of human beings? Like, what are we yearning for?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Do we want to just pause on that one? Because I think that's a good question, sure. just to open up on. So one important motivation behind this is the Enlightenment motivation. Not what I was talking about, but from the Enlightenment, the Promethean spirit, as O'Hara calls it, that we will steal fire from the gods and we will make ourselves into gods thereby. And that if we just give in to the momentum of science and technology, men and women and people will be gods. I remember when I was a kid, there was a book by H.G. Wells called Men Like Gods, and it's like, that's the Promethean spirit. I will sometimes recite that title when I'm in an airplane and it's taking off, because I'm trying to get a sense of remember what's going on, what's behind this really, it used to be a wonder-filled technology, right?
Yeah.
So there's the Promethean spirit. That's what I was trying to get out in the AI talk when I said there's a sense of betrayal. We've been told by Kant and Hegel, and perhaps Kojev's reading of Hegel, that we are the greatest discovery is that we are the authors of history, not the gods. We are the authors of history, not the gods. And the teleos of history is us and our freedom. And that's what it's all been for. And it gets like, oh, actually, no, we're not the gods. These machines are, and we're not the telos. They could potentially eradicate us and replace us. And there has been no great culmination. Part, I think, of what we need to properly grieve is the fact that the success of this project, and it's, like I say, it's showing up in individual lives, like the way I think it's hit Jeff Hinton, is the betrayal of, we've actually been portrayed by the Promethean spirit in a very powerful way. We are not the authors or the telos. We are not the gods, and we are not the telos. And so I just wanted to note that. I think that's a powerful motivation, but it has culminated in something that has completely undermined the motivation. Another one is there's a kind of myopia in which people get very enthusiastic and obsessed with their particular speciality, to the exclusion of stepping back and seeing the larger whole that it should belong in. And we have various social tropes around this. We have the mad scientist, we have the social trope of the nerd, we have the social trope. And of course, the Big Bang Theory made a lot off of that trope. in a very powerful way. But, we have the Frankensteinian version of it with the mad scientist who's, I'm going to create life. And that's where that particular thing and the Promethean come together. They come together in the Frankensteinian. I've got to do this, right? There's the obsession with doing it. And, Frankenstein is just obsessed with it. But then when he triumphs, he proclaims that he knows what it's like to be a god. And so the Promethean spirit and this, I don't know what to call it, this particular spirit of being obsessed with the trees at the expense of the forest is also a powerful driver. Those two can interact with the fact that people can find a way to leap very quickly up the social hierarchy. People who are working in relative obscurity within academia can suddenly be sought after by mega corporations. This is a project that offers that particular temptation. And there's been other projects like that. There's being a rock star, which is also the same thing. And we know
so interesting.
We know what that does, right? We know all of these come with really strong warnings, right? The Promethean one is like the betrayal. The mad scientist obviously carries with it, you're going to produce the monstrous. We're more ambivalent around the nerd trope. We're sort of critical of it, but we sort of have also opened up and been more loving. Big Bang Theory is a prototypical example, but there's also still some critique in there, and all of them end up married to women, and they start to build lives outside. So there's a warning there about isolation and alienation, and possibly resentment, which is possible. There's the rock star phenomena, which is people who otherwise would be majorly disenfranchised. They find an occupation or perhaps even a vocation that can rapidly cause them to go up the social hierarchy. But then we have the rock star trope, and the warning therein. I think there's also, in addition to all of those, a legitimate scientific interest, which is one of the ways we should try to understand intelligence is by trying to make it. The CogSci, strong AI design stance, and it has enormous advantages. You don't have to worry, at least until very recently, with the ethics of the machine. You can just build it, take it apart, do what you want with it. The machines, until recently, unlike human beings, aren't trying to please us or deceive us. Machines are now, but until recently, they didn't do that. And because we make it, we can just do an engineering end run over having to gather all the empirical data about what intelligence is. So it gives you this powerful new method for trying to get at intelligence and consciousness. It gets us out of behaviorism. It also comes with powerful warnings too, which is, but you hit the simulation problem. You have to balance that engineering end run with genuine scientific experimentation, and the two have to act in opponent processing with each other, which is, I'm biased, but this is one of the things that CogSci argues for and advocates. So I think those are some of the major motivations for it. And then, of course, once there is actual technological success, there's the usual Moloch motivations of, game theoretic competition and massive property and power and greed and all those kinds of things. That would be at least my best initial take.
Ooh, that's a lot to contend with. I'm struck by how with the Promethean motivation, there's this poetic irony. It's like the book of Genesis where Adam and Eve eat the apple and their eyes are open, and God says, they start to cover themselves because they're like, we're naked. And God says, who told you you were naked? This represents a period where God is like, who told you you were gods?
Yes.
Right. And now, once again, we are being banished or thrown out of the Garden of Eden, the proverbial Garden of Eden.
Yes. And you've got the Tower of Babel, where we will build a tower and we will fly into the heavens. We will
Oh, right.
challenge the gods, and God
Right.
comes down and enters,
Confounds the
creates,
language. Yeah.
yeah, creates confusion and incomprehensibility between people.
Which
Yes,
is wild. What a what a perfect metaphor, because that is precisely what is happening right now. I mean, at least
yes,
in a lot of different arenas, political arena, I would argue even the cultural arena, there's been a lot of confusion. I don't know if you're familiar with the so-called red-pilled community. It's, how would I describe it generously? It's basically run by a lot of young men who are afflicted by the patriarchy. They wouldn't put it this way, but they're afflicted by the patriarchy, and they are creating videos on YouTube primarily to tell other young men that this is how you game the system. You game the system by trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible. You treat women like objects to be commodified and not actually as human beings to be in relationship with. And a lot of these videos include men debating young women who are often ignorant of this entire, history, etc., and sort of very adversarial processing.
yes,
They,
yes. I see.
get in debates, and then they destroy the women in the debates, and then, the clicks and the likes follow. But that, for all of that toxicity, for all of the toxicity that's present in those conversations, there's also like a real wound that is
Of course.
also present,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, how can we address it? Who can address it? Because obviously it's compelling to a lot of young men, right? Because a lot of young men are searching for meaning and searching for sense of worthiness, and this is the system in which they live. And so it's like, how can we create the necessary dialectic dialogue such that something else can be compelling to these young men?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a systems problem, because the algorithms are designed to do what they do, right? And oftentimes that presupposes adversarial processing,
Yes, it
right?
does.
So there's a lot of different complexities that I'm just awakening to for the first time, and also wanting to play with and open up and approach in the spirit of play, ultimately, in order to come up with
Mm.
solutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to not. I mean, in what a Q&A, I got very frustrated recent Q&A about not with the people asking the question, but with, I think, and maybe Jeff Hinton and I, maybe we shared this.
Mm.
I had hoped, I had hoped that the science would lead us into the AI. Right?
Mm.
We would get a generalizable theory of intelligence and rationality and consciousness and how they're all interrelated. And then that science could in turn, and this is maybe specific to me and not with Jeff, but is um, that science could be bound to wisdom cultivation. That's what I've been trying to do. That had been my great hope. My great hope is, well, this is going to happen, but what we can do is we can do cog-sci, and we can really develop the science, and we can keep using that science to understand and cultivate and promote rationality and wisdom. My great
Mm.
fear, and some of my students at U of T could tell you this, my great fear was what we would find some way to hack our way into
Oh.
AGI, which is what we primarily have done here. At least that's what I argue in the video.
Mm.
And I got very, I was asked a question about, people liked the video, but they were said, but you've got Moloch and you've got all these systems and all this running, and how can you possibly, and given the failure, my hope was dashed and my fear was realized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got very emotionally involved,
Mm-hmm.
and there was anger and frustration at these people. I do think they should be criticized. I do think they should be
Mm-hmm.
criticized for Promethean spirit,
Sure.
and for being myopic and for all the other things we've talked about. Um, but I don't think we should demonize them. I do think what we need to do is to realize. I think we should also not deify them. They are not the people to go to ask how we should go about wisely, right, responding to this, because they have no answers about this, because they are technical experts. And I take one of Plato's greatest themes running through many of his arguments is that wisdom is not a techne. It is not a kind of technical expertise. And therefore, turning to an expert, techne, for example, can't tell you what the right use of the techne is. It is morally and ethically neutral. So it doesn't contain the normative development, which is why I was emphasizing that so much, by the way, in my talk. And so these people have nothing to offer us in terms of what should we do now. Their expertise is not relevant. But what I found is I'll be honest and hopefully self-critical. I got a little bit angry, although people really liked it in the Q&A. I got a little bit angry. I got quite emotional. And Pathe is always dangerous, but I got a little bit angry because these people were still putting themselves forth as experts on this question. But then sort of, I think maybe half consciously realizing they had nothing to say. And then I was also frustrated with the Molochian problematic. But I've now, upon reflection, I would say we should definitely criticize the behavior, but we should neither deify nor demonize these people. We should allow them into the discourse, of course. I'm not proposing any kind of censorship or prohibition, but I think they should not have any special status. I think we need to pay attention to people whose work has been to deal with normative components of cognition, like at least normatively inflected, like rationality and wisdom. And that's a much broader and more integrated field of people we need to bring into this discussion. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's right for doing what we're doing to try and get at the motivation and also rightly to criticize a lot of these motivations as having a lot of self-deception and a lot of self-destruction and potentially a lot of other and even world destruction capacity in them. I think that's all legitimate. But I want to prevent idolizing or demonizing the individuals like this. I was moved by Jeff Hinton's act of integrity and to think, yes, okay, the degree to which these people want to step out of that myopic Promethean spirit and enter into serious reflection, we should welcome them. So sorry, that was a bit of a speech, but I felt it was important to make it.
No, that's okay. I'm curious. Well, one of the things I wrote down in my notepad when I was at this event on AI was that I wrote something like, this is an emergency level situation, and one of the responses needs to be that the engineers and the builders of these technologies need to be encouraged to adopt a wisdom practice.
Yes, they have to. They have
to, right? They have to.
Yes, that's what I argued. We need to provide readily available templates of rationality and wisdom. And we also need more rationality in the Platonic sense and the Hegelian sense, and wisdom in order to properly try and foresee how we should go forward. Yeah, I totally agree with that. The things that concern me are, and I see the corporate world doing this, so maybe you bumped into this. It was like, how can we best use this new tool to improve our share of the market and to beat our competitors? And it's like, you don't understand. This isn't
Mm.
the closest analog I can come to is the atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And like this isn't, it's kind of a tool, but turning it into a tool has actually turned out to be tremendously difficult. It was actually a world changing
Mm.
technology. By the way, um, that is, I hold that out as a clear instance of something that is at least possible. You had a bunch of people, scientists, and some of them who were interested in a wider framing other than their own expertise, Einstein among them, who foresaw that the generation of a chain reaction implied the real possibility of the atomic bomb. And there was a threshold that they foresaw. And then there was the marshaling of the resources, right, the Manhattan Project, to try and at least make sure that this did not fall into the hands of the Nazis, right?
Right. Right.
And so we do have that capacity where we are confronting a world-changing, perhaps world-extinguishing technology, foreseeing it, and trying to marshal a coordinated project such that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So just to give an example of where we had some success around this.
I do wonder if we have the will or the perception that it is on the level of the atomic bomb.
Well, the one thing I want to challenge, and I want to encourage everybody to challenge the people who just say this is just another tool and another technology. It's not. It's not. That is to misunderstand, right? This is a technology that carries the possibility of autonomy and also ultimately conflict with us, autonomously driven conflict with us. And that's a different kind of thing. We haven't had that before. So we just genuinely need to acknowledge this. And we also, so I'm going to quote Vladimir Lenin, which I find a terrifically ironic thing to be doing here right now. But I like this quote from Lenin. And this doesn't make me a Marxist. I'm clearly not. And if you think I am, but Lenin said, when it comes time to hang the capitalists, they will sell you the rope. And I fear.
Do you think that's true? Because this is back to debt and wealth creation and,
well, is it? I don't think it's teleologically true. I don't think like it's an inevitability. Is it a real possibility? Yes. I think it's possible that yes, because because of hyperbolic discounting and because of the fact that although I don't think this will be exponential forever, and I gave reasons for that. It could be exponential for a while. And
can you remind me what hyperbolic discounting?
Hyperbolic discounting is, and this is again an adaptive thing, is we prioritize a current stimulus over a future stimulus, even if the future stimulus is much more valued by us.
Is this like the marshmallow test?
The marshmallow test, or you want $5 now or $100 a year from now? I'll take the $5 now, right? Kind of thing. Right. And it's adaptive, but the problem is it also makes us procrastinate. It makes us very bad at doing things, especially if they're taking off very rapidly. Because right now, for many people, like when I was first doing the research on the GPT machines, especially when GPT-4 came out, because GPT-3 was sort of easy to trick. And it was like, right. But then GPT-4, still deep problems in it. And I go through those in detail, as you know, in the video essay. But when that came out, I was walking around like for the first week. Here, let me give you an analogy. The only book that truly horrified me and terrified me, when The Stand did, but only when I was reading it, right? Okay. Was 1984. Because when it was done,
I thought you were going to say this.
Yeah, and it was like, I was like, but what defense do we have against Big Brother? And I was just waiting for, right? And then I was walking around for the first week or so, and it was like, I was trying to convey to everybody, everything is about to change. And everybody's sort of looking at me like, and they're like, even my partner, and she's like, and she's like, she's a rational, foresightful, deep person, right? And she got it over time, but initially it was like I couldn't point to anything in her life that was evidence for what I was saying. I was saying, well, this and this and this and this, and it's like, and it's like, as long and it's like, oh, right, it's like that. We don't really see it, and then by the time it's invading our lives, it might be too late. That's the kind of thing I'm worried about. That's why I mean, why we might be sort of, wow, let's really pour money into these corporations because of all for the next 3 months, I'll just be making so much more money on the stock market. And then 6 months thereafter, I've been replaced by machines who can do the stock market way better than I ever could and are owned by the corporations. And I've just been shut out by overwhelming competition. And I didn't realize I'd be made irrelevant. I thought I would always have access. It's like, why did you think that?
Competition, I didn't realize that if I put competition as my highest value on the value of hierarchies that I hold, that it would eventually lead to me being obsolete.
Yes, but in a way that interacts with this hyperbolic discounting, so you can't foresee it well enough.
Right.
That's why I was trying to get people out of a certain framework. The tool, how can I use this to make more money and advance my social status and blah, blah, blah. That is the framing that will blind us myopically and put us into grave danger so that when it comes time to hang us, the capitalists will sell us the rope. Sorry, right? So I was trying to reframe it as don't think of these machines that way. Let's think about them as the potentials they have, the thresholds, and each one of these thresholds moves them towards being autonomous, rational, self-directing, self-correcting, self-transcending beings. And those thresholds is where we can make choices about how we can steer that project and wrap it into an enculturation project such that we have a chance of, well, a hopeful future rather than a dystopian one.
And do you think something like Jeff's departure is going to do more than pinprick the community that is tasked with building these things? Like, do you think that these warning signs are being heeded?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in that there's the proposal that has gained quite a bit of steam of a moratorium for 6 months, the 6 months pause. But notice it's framed in this interesting way. We can pause for 6 months because we're that far ahead of China, who we're competing with. That's why we can pause for 6 months, right? Because if China wasn't that far behind, and so there's that weird, right, the tragedy of the commons and competition thing. So there's that, but there's again these people, and again, I'm trying to be fair, right? There's an over interpretation of intelligence as a phenomena at the expense of rationality and wisdom that is not being awoken to. And both the utopians and the dystopians treat intelligence like a magic wand that will make all limitations and all problems go away. We have no reason to believe that. Right. And I gave a lot of arguments why we shouldn't believe that. We have no reason to believe that these machines will all just naturally cooperate together. We will have no reason to believe that they won't be faced internally by subpersonalities and massive, internal conflict. We don't know, and we genuinely don't know. But one of the things I think it's reasonable is that we can understand that, like all other phenomena, intelligence exists precisely because it is inherently internally constrained in some fashion.
Right.
That's what makes it
limits.
Yes, right. And that therefore there are things it can't do that have to be done by rationality and by wisdom. And so yes, the pause is good, but it's only they're still framing everything quantitatively. right? Rather than qualitatively. It's not just a quantity of intelligence we're talking about here. It's the quality of the cognitive processes at work. And so, yes and no, I think is the answer to your question.
Do you think that some of our more adversarial processing oriented ways of being, whether it's, let's say, the algorithm on social media, let's say YouTube, although YouTube is a bit more, YouTube lends itself to more than just adversarial processing, but let's take YouTube for a second. Do you think that that can be Zened?
I like that, a verb. That's great. Okay, so let's first of all problematize the question. It's an open question, and I'll take it that way, but I first want to make it problematic.
Okay.
I'm not going to redo all the argument, but the main idea is there are inherent trade-offs, right?
Yes.
There's inherent trade-offs between coherency and completeness, or consistency and completeness, I should have said. There's inherent trade-off between worrying about bias and worrying about variance. Many heuristics have trade-off relationships, and you can capitalize this, and I argue that intelligence capitalizes on this by creating opponent processing to capitalize on these trade-offs. But everything adaptive carries with it propensity to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Once you get that there's a kind of inevitability between trade-offs and opponent processing, you then realize, oh, wait, opponent processing always carries with it the possibility that it can be gamed in a sort of game theoretic fashion by a short-term improvement by shifting to adversarial processing. Think of American politics. Opponent processing, democracy, great idea. But wait, although we'll, in the end, undermine democracy, if we short-term go to adversarial processing and demonize and try to destroy the opposition for a short-term period, this is the hyperbolic discounting, we can get elected. And so part of the Zen would have to be, right, building the internalized commitment to resisting the short-term gains of adversarial processing that undermine opponent processing in a profound way. And I've also argued that these machines are not going to be homogeneous. They can't be, because intelligence can't be. First of all, if as these machines are now demonstrating, if there's real emergence, there's real uncertainty, there's real novelty, things where we can't calculate the risk, that's also going to be true for them. I take it that that's a feature of reality and these limitations. And these trade-offs can't be decided a priori. They have to be decided in an environmentally relative fashion. In this environment, worrying more about bias is more important than variance, but in this environment, it is the exact opposite. And as these machines go into the complexity, complex, variegated nature of reality, they will also, right, have to adopt different perspectives because they take a different stand on different environments and different problem sets, etc. So they are going to also have to deal with this problem not only within themselves, but between themselves. So the temptation for intelligent opponent processing to be rationally self-corrected being supplanted by short-term adversarial processing, unless they have become internally committed to virtue, they will fall prey to it. Why wouldn't they? Well, because they'll be so much more intelligent. That's precisely the problem.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good response. I was thinking, because the problem is, how do we inspire? How might we inspire people to aspire to wisdom quick enough?
Yes.
To get ahead of the problem. And so if there's existing algorithms that already utilize adversarial processing that turns people into polarized, beings, and how might we position something as adversarial, let's say, to get someone to click on something, only to find out, oh, you've fallen down an opponent processing rabbit hole, and you didn't, and you thought you were going to get adversarial processing, but you actually got opponent processing. Like, might that be a way to Zen what's going on.
Yeah, it's kind of a Zen jujitsu move kind of thing.
Right.
Yes, and it's kind of Socratic seduction in that sense. Yeah. Um, see, my concern. Let's again problematize it and then try to answer it again. My concern is one of the things that's going to be rapidly accelerated by these machines is the meaning crisis. It's going to exacerbate it tremendously. In many ways, people are going to be disenfranchised, not only economically and politically, but also culturally. Like, for example, whole industries are on the verge of being wiped out. The amount of people will need to be models. Just to choose an easy example. Oh, we have human beings, and what they do is they model for us, and we take pictures of them. We don't need those people anymore. They're gone.
Will this drive a demand for beauty, though? Beauty in the higher sense?
It could, or it could also, as I worried, it could be taken up by pornography and making it. We can now easily, because there's no. Think about it. Think about it, Chloe. There's no real human beings involved. So portraying these pictures, like we could show whatever pornographic dark fantasy we want. And where's the immorality in that? Because nobody's been commodified. There's no real person here. And we've made it perfect. And, and we know how to, that's a real possibility too, right? So there's going to be lots of people disenfranchised. And by the way, that sets up revolution, massive disenfranchised of all people that were previously considered at least middle or higher than middle class. That's going to be problematic.
Didn't you make this point about Louis XIV?
Yeah, that's exactly what Louis XIV did. He disenfranchised most of the nobility, and then that weakened their ability to hold down the peasantry, and it also opened up the competition amongst the nobility. I won't go into that. So there's that. There's also that, our sense of, and I talked a lot about this in the video, what is it to be a human being? Our identity, what makes us unique, what makes us worthwhile, what really matters to us. What if the Protestant dream collapses and we find that life isn't about work? That being a good person is not about being a good worker, being a dedicated, obedient worker. What is it? So there's lots of ways in which this is going to massively exacerbate the meaning crisis. And I think that will cause an initial ramping up of adversarial processing as people scramble to the last of the lifeboats, the humanity lifeboats, as the Promethean Titanic is sinking. I'm concerned about that. Now, the other thing we can do, and this is sort of more like Asimov's Foundation, and it's funny how a lot of science fiction has become immediately relevant. We could build the counterculture. We can steal the culture. We can and ramp it up, and we can the increase in the meaning crisis could draw more and more people into this project, and more people also seeing that. I think this is really the only game in town for us to try and deal with this. So that's my answer.
Okay. Two very different options. Yes. Strikingly different.
Well, we're in a kairos, and we talked about this earlier. This isn't freedom. Feel how this is not freedom. We're in a kairos of options. Do you feel free now? Do you feel liberated, or do you feel overwhelmingly burdened? I'm talking to the people who's listening. Sure. Do you feel overwhelmingly burdened by this because you do not know how to take on this responsibility properly? Right. Exactly.
Right. And I just saw Interstellar for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
2 weeks ago. So I'm also sitting with that archetypal, simultaneously Promethean, but actually weirdly grounded in a love agapic ethos.
Well, it's a weird movie because initially I thought this movie, I've seen the movie twice, and I liked it better the second time than the first time. Because originally I thought this movie was, reminding us of that we're not gods. In a profound way, and only gods can move through the cosmos, and we're not. We're human beings. We can't deal with relativistic facts like oh, you were gone for 8 minutes, and it turned out to be 33 years. Like we just can't handle that. But then it said, oh, but don't worry, you're going to be gods, and I thought that was a little bit right. But yeah, you're right. The relationship between the father and the daughter is It's a very powerful one. And it's holding out the theme about intergenerational agapic love as being really centrally important. It didn't quite know how to do what to do with that theme, but it was at least
Yeah.
holding that out. Yeah.
Yeah. And Anne Hathaway's character says, just like time is real and space is a force, love is also a force.
Yes,
And she's
yes,
trying
yes.
to convince them to go in a different route. It is a kairos moment. It is a very exciting moment. I mean, at least from the perspective that I'm sitting in, or standing from, like, given that the work that I do and given the work that we do, in your study of the dawning of Christianity, was there a similar kairos in the sense that, you know, for your reading of it, was there like this is obviously where we don't want to go, and this is obviously where we do want to go? When
Yeah.
St. Aug and all these people were talking about still in the culture. Is that your read, or was it a bit more uh
Well, I mean, it's hard to because of course many of them thought the world was ending very quickly,
right?
and so there's ways in which their ethos
Mm.
didn't transfer to us until maybe now,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but if you take a look, there is a kairos moment, um, and it's a really interesting one, which is how bound to Judaism is this emergent thing going to be? And
Mm-hmm.
between
Mm-hmm.
um, there's a tension between let's call it a Jesus movement, just try to use
Mm-hmm.
it, who sees Jesus primarily as squarely within and the fulfillment of Jewish tradition. And that
Mm-hmm.
maybe was epitomized by people like Peter and James. It's hard to talk about any of these people as historical because it's so
Sure.
um, somebody
Murky.
who is definitely historical, who is definitely opposed to it, is Paul. And
Mm-hmm.
Paul makes the sort of uh, makes the decision that Christianity should be severed from
Mm-hmm.
Judaism, and then sets up a very problematic relation, which is going to, it's going to release Christianity into the world, and
Mm-hmm.
and and that enables it to capture, to steal the culture from the Greco-Roman. Uh,
Mm.
but like all kairos, there's a dark side to that, and you and I briefly talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
There's the creation of anti-Semitism and the laying in of anti-Semitism also
Mm-hmm.
within that history.
This is true.
Exactly. I got the book. Yes, yes,
Nice. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there was that. Um, there's they had more time. They had once they
Mm.
realized that Jesus was not coming back, at least not imminently. Um, they had 2 or 3 centuries, and they were
Right.
often very conflicted centuries in which they were trying to work out all of these things, generating these doctrines that were trying, like the doctrine of the Trinity, to try and get the
Mm-hmm.
opponent processing in place. One way of understanding the Trinity is a philosophical and then religious, but a philosophical solution to how do we embed opponent processing into the sacred. Well, we make the
Mm.
sacred simultaneously multiple and but
Mm.
integrated, bound together in dialogically, but yet
Mm.
sharing an identity, and then right and Jesus
Yeah.
takes into himself all these typically conflicting relationships of prophet, priest, and king, because all three
Yeah.
of those groups are and so you've got all of this.
Huh.
Let's make this opponent processing thing. And so I think that gives Christianity, especially Christian Neoplatonism, a really powerful generative engine for a long time, and then it sort of ossifies and solidifies
Yeah.
in a dangerous way. So
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody said, oh, like they knew they were in a kairos, they were trying to
Sure.
change the world.
Sure.
They didn't foresee some of the dark side, the anti-Semitism,
Mm.
um, but they also did this really interesting thing. They collectively, no individual did it. They used distributed cognition to build this opponent processing into their notion of the sacred in a profound way that gave
Mm.
them a very powerful way of making a self-correcting institution and culture for quite a while, I would argue.
Mm. How did they what is one example of how they built opponent processing into distributed cognition?
Well, I mean, so
Unless you mean
Jesus,
like the Trinity, for example.
yeah. Well, so
Yeah.
Jesus is both fully human and fully divine,
Right.
right? And we are supposed to
Simultaneously.
emulate him.
Yeah.
Well, what does that do for us? Why do we need that opponent processing? And this is the great Platonic insight. And then Christianity sticks the
Mm-hmm.
incarnation onto it. The great Platonic insight is we are finite transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
We are capable of transcendence, but we always remain finite. We will never become gods. We will always be right finite. But we should never give in to our finitude, because if we just think we are just finite, then we give into despair and servitude,
Mm-hmm.
and we make ourselves vulnerable to being enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, well, we identify with our transcendence. We are godlike, men like gods, and right. And of
Right.
course, then there's the hubris, and then we fall
Mm-hmm.
prey to becoming tyrants and becoming
Mm-hmm.
self-destructive. So what you want you want I don't like the English word tension, so I use the Greek word tonos. You want this
Okay.
creative tension, like the tension of a bow, the
Mm-hmm.
tonos that makes the bow work. You want this tonos between finitude and transcendence. Well, the incarnation is like, boom,
So yeah.
follow that. And it's like, but I can't, but I should, but I can. I can because he's fully man. I can't fully human. I can't because he's fully God, right? But I
Yeah.
can and I can't. And I like God became human, so humans can become gods. And then you say, oh, now can you explain to me the incarnation then, how it actually works? And every attempt to interpret the incarnation is declared a heresy. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't resolve it, and it's constantly doing this to you and
Mm-hmm.
pushing you to constantly explore your transcendence, but also acknowledge in humility your finitude.
Mm. It
That's
seems
a
like that's a very profound and powerful response to the kairos.
yes,
And
yes,
it's brilliant. Also, it's sophisticated.
yes, it is.
I was yeah. It's we take it for granted, but yeah.
And it's produced by collective intelligence. There's no
Right.
one person that is the
Right.
author of the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right.
Now, you see, that's a really interesting thing because, of course, and rightly,
Mm-hmm.
Muslims and Jews are saying, but the Trinity is a philosophical monster. And it's
Right.
like, right. And so that has to be kept in balance with the profound functionality of the Trinity for doing this kind of work in a
Mm.
powerful way.
Mm. It seems to me that the move now is to remember our finitude.
But until very recently, the move, right, in the whole AI project was to aspire to godhood.
Right. Right. So there's the absence of a humility.
Right,
And
which is
yeah.
why something like the Platonic and Neoplatonic corpus could be very valuable to us right now in place of just a technical laying out of our limits and the
Yeah.
growth of the machines.
Yeah. It's very elegant how it maps on to the elements. And what I mean by that is, with Interstellar being an example, you have this theme, this trope of us trying to reach the heavens, right?
Yes,
Again,
yes, yeah,
Tower of Babel, the motto of the city of New York is Excelsior, ever
yeah,
upward. And I
yeah.
see this when I go into, a big New York building, and I used to be so moved by that. And now I think, oh, how utterly foolish and
Yeah.
how absolutely terrible, actually. And I'm thinking again also of the etymology of the word humility. Humility comes from humus, to be of the earth,
Or
to
of
remember
the
that
earth,
you are
yes,
of
yes,
the earth,
yes.
right?
And
And so,
Adam means clay of the earth as
right,
well.
of the earth, right?
Yes,
And so there's a there's a forgetfulness, or there's a forgetting of what it means to be human
yes.
in this quest to simply reach the heavens without remembering that you are of the earth. There's a Turkish proverb that I came across a few years ago that says, "Be humble, for you are made of you are made of earth." Excuse me, and be noble, for you are made of stars.
Yes, yes,
And both are true, right? We
yes.
are actually made of both stardust and earth, and it's this remembering that we have to start doing now more than ever at the present moment.
I agree. That's a good proverb. I've been quoting from Moby Dick,
Mm.
Where the preacher gives the sermon before they set sail,
Mm.
and there's a line he utters in there, and he says, "What is man that he should live out the lifetime of his God?" Right, the desire to be
Mm.
godlike is both ennobling, and this is what Moby Dick is all about. Right,
Yeah.
and Ahab is the prototypical figure. There's something noble
Right.
and admirable about Ahab, but there's also something deep. His lack,
Right.
right, of humility, uh,
Right.
his hubris. Well, Chloe, I've got to go, but this has been really wonderful. I've really, uh, I really enjoyed how this just unfolded and took on a life of its own. Um,
Likewise. This was awesome.
yeah, and I think it's right to bring these two conversations into deep contact with each other the way we did, and I encourage people to keep doing that. I really think this is fantastic stuff. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, John. Take care. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, me too.